In the backwoods of Georgia, in the year 1806, a family hid a secret so strange that doctors, priests, and townsfolk alike refused to speak of it, for children born normal. But with each passing year, something impossible began to happen. While the rest of the world grew older, they grew younger. Their hair darkened instead of turning gray, their skin smooth instead of wrinkling. And by the time the oldest should have been a man, he looked like a child who had never seen pain. But what began as a medical curiosity soon twisted into a horror story no one dared to write down. Welcome to Behind the Genius, the place where we uncover the mysteries history tried to bury. Here, we take you inside the strange, the unexplained, and the terrifying truths hidden behind genius and madness. And in today's story, we go deep into one of the most unsettling cases in American history, the tale of the siblings who aged in reverse. In the early spring of 1806, when the air was still damp from the winter rains and the earth smelled of pine and red clay, the Mason family's farm sat quietly on the edge of a small, unmarked road in rural Georgia. It was the kind of place where the sun rose slowly over the tree line, where fog clung to ground until midday, and where the sound of a crow's call could travel for miles. Elias Mason was a farmer, a man whose hands were worn from years of plowing the stubborn earth, and whose back was bent from carrying more than just the weight of harvests. His wife, Clara, was a midwife, known in the surrounding counties for her gentle touch and ability to bring babies safely into the world. They had 7 children in total, and though life was never easy, there was warmth inside their small wooden house. The Mason children grew up barefoot and sunburnt, chasing each other to the cornfields, climbing the thick oak trees, and wading in the creek at the back of the property. The oldest, Peter, was 17 and already working the land alongside his father. The youngest, little Ruth, had only just begun to walk. The middle ones filled the house with noise, laughter, and arguments. But among them were the 4 who would become the center of a story so strange, so unsettling, that it would be whispered about long after the last of them was gone. Their names were Samuel, Margaret, Thomas, and Ruth, the youngest 4 of the 7, and the ones whose lives will unfold in reverse. It began with Samuel. At 12 years old, he was strong for his age, his shoulders broadening, his voice deepening, his appetite endless. But in the summer of that year, Clara noticed something odd. At first, it was so small that she told herself she was imagining it. Samuel's hair, which had been getting lighter in the sun, seemed darker than before, as if the summer heat had no effect on it. His skin, instead of showing the roughness of outdoor work, appeared smoother, like that of a younger child. His voice, too, had lost some of its depth. She told herself boys could grow unevenly, that changes in the body came in strange waves. But by autumn, the difference could not be ignored. Samuel's face looked rounder, almost childish, and his clothes hung on him as though he had shrunk. Elias noticed it too, though he tried to hide his concern. "Maybe the boy's just losing weight," he said one evening, poking at his stew without much appetite. "Hard work can take it out of you." But Clara shook her head. "Children don't grow smaller, Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling. By the winter of 1807, there was no denying it. Samuel, now 13 by the calendar, looked no older than 10. His voice was high again, his hands soft, his once awkward teenage frame now small and neat like a child's. And worse, he began to forget things, not just lessons or chores, but events. He could not remember where he had left his shoes, could not recall a fishing trip he'd taken only weeks before. Once, when Peter came into the room, Samuel stared at him blankly for a moment before recognition flickered in his eyes. The Masons told no one outside the family. In a rural Georgia town at the start of the 19th century, unusual illness was often seen as punishment from God, or worse, the work of the devil. Word of strange happenings could ruin a family, or invite the attention of those who believed in curing evil by force. So they kept Samuel's changes quiet, hoping they would reverse themselves. But then Margaret, 2 years younger than Samuel, began to change as well. At first, it was only her hair. The pale streaks that had appeared from sun and age seemed to vanish, replaced by a deep chestnut shine. Her skin grew flawless, the faint freckles on her cheeks fading away. When she laughed, it was higher, lighter than before. By her 11th birthday, She looked like a girl of 8. Clara's heart began to pound every time she looked at them together. Samuel and Margaret, 2 children moving backward through time. At night, Clara prayed harder than she ever had before. She prayed for God to halt whatever curse had taken hold of her children. She prayed for her other 3, Thomas, Peter, and Ruth, to be spared. But prayers did little, and by the spring of 1808, Thomas had begun to change too. It was then that the neighbors started to whisper. People in the countryside knew more than families liked to admit. It didn't matter how careful the Masons were, how much they avoided public gatherings. Changes like these did not go unnoticed. A woman down the road swore she saw Samuel in the fields late one night, walking in the fog, speaking to someone who wasn't there. Others claimed the children's eyes looked different, brighter, almost glassy, as though reflecting something no one else could see. One Sunday, the preacher spoke from the pulpit about unnatural things that walk among us, and the sins of the fathers visited upon the children. Elias kept his gaze on the floor. Clara held Ruth close, and neither dared to look at the people around them. By summer, the Masons had drawn more attention than they wanted. That was when Dr. Amos Green arrived. He was a traveling physician from Savannah, passing through the countryside to see patients. He had heard rumors of the Mason children and insisted on visiting. Clara wanted to turn him away, but Elias thought perhaps he could help. Dr. Green examined Samuel first. He was startled. According to the records Elias kept, the boy was 14, but by every physical sign, he was a healthy child of 8. His skin was warm, his heartbeat steady, his breathing strong. But when Green gently pressed along Samuel's spine, he felt bones that seemed smaller than they should be. "It's as though his body's clock is running backwards," the doctor murmured. Margaret's examination brought the same result. Thomas was just beginning to show the same signs. Only little Ruth, then 3 years old, seemed unchanged. Dr. Green could offer no explanation. "I've seen fever take a child, and I've seen hunger steal their growth," he said, shaking his head. "But I have never seen time itself betray them." The doctor wanted to stay longer, to observe, but Elias refused. There was something in Green's eyes, a mix of curiosity and fear, that made him uneasy. The last thing he wanted was the children taken away for study, or worse. That night, Clara woke to find Samuel standing at the window, staring into the darkness beyond the fields. She asked him what he was looking at. He turned slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "She's calling us," he said. Clara's blood ran cold. "Who's calling you, Samuel?" He blinked, as though trying to remember. "I don't know, but I think I used to." From that night on, Clara could not sleep without fear. She knew in her heart that whatever was happening was not just an illness. Something else, something unseen, had placed its hand on her children, and it was pulling them backwards. The summer of 1808 in Georgia was thick with heat, the kind that made the air feel heavy and slowed every step you took. Cicadas screamed from the trees, and the pine-scented wind carried the low rumble of distant thunderstorms. On the Mason farm, that summer brought no relief, only deeper fear. Samuel, Margaret, and Thomas were not just changing, they were unchanging and then undoing. Every week, their bodies seemed to lose another year. Samuel, who should have been entering his young manhood, now had the soft features of a boy just starting school. His shoulders had narrowed, his voice had returned to a light, almost musical tone in his hands. One strong enough to carry buckets from the well, now trembled under their weight. Margaret, once tall for her age, could no longer reach the top shelves in the kitchen without a stool. Thomas had lost 2 inches in height since spring, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. But it wasn't only their bodies. Their minds were slipping, too. Samuel began asking questions about things he had once known by heart. How to hitch the mule to the plow, how to find the fishing spot by the creek, the names of neighbors they had known since birth. Margaret would start a sentence and then pause, staring into the distance as though her thoughts had scattered. Thomas, who had been able to read short Bible verses, struggled to recognize letters. Clara tried to hide it from the younger children, especially Ruth, who was still untouched by the strange affliction. But even Ruth began to notice. One morning, she told her mother in a hushed voice, "Sammy talks to the wall when nobody's here." When Clara asked Samuel about it, he laughed nervously and said he was talking to himself. But late at night, when the house was quiet, she sometimes heard him whispering, not the random mutterings of a boy, but deliberate conversation, with pauses as though someone was answering back. The Masons' neighbors, suspicious already, began keeping their distance. No one came to borrow flour or trade eggs anymore. At church, people turned to watch when the family walked in. Elias felt the eyes on him, but he kept his head high, refusing to let anyone think they had something to be ashamed of. Still, he noticed how some mothers pulled their children closer, how whispers started the moment the Mason children left the room. In August, the heat finally broke with a violent storm. Rain pounded the roof, and lightning split the sky in jagged streaks. The family sat together in the main room, the fire crackling low, when Thomas suddenly gasped and pointed toward the window. "There," he said, his voice trembling. Everyone turned. For a moment, Clara thought it was just a shadow of the oak trees shifting in the wind. But then she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the field, where the lightning lit the ground in quick flashes. It was tall, thin, and still, dressed in something that hung loosely from its frame. The face was hidden in shadow. "Get away from the window," Elias ordered. But before anyone could move, lightning struck again and the figure was gone. That night, Margaret had a dream, or at least she thought it was a dream. She said she saw the same figure standing in the doorway of her bedroom, calling her name in a voice that was not quite human. The voice, she said, was sweet but heavy, like honey poured too thick. When she tried to scream, she found she couldn't move. She woke with tears on her cheeks and dirt on her feet, though she swore she had not left her bed. Clara began to keep the children inside after dark, locking the doors and barring the windows. But the changes continued, faster now. Dr. Green returned unexpectedly in September, saying he had been in the area and wanted to see the children. Elias hesitated, but Clara, desperate for answers, let him in. Green was visibly shaken by what he saw. He examined Samuel's hands and found the calluses of farm work completely gone. His teeth, once slightly crooked, were now small and even like a younger child's. Margaret's eyesight, which had begun to weaken 2 years earlier, was now perfect again. Thomas's baby teeth, which he had lost, seemed to be growing back. "This is not possible," Green said, pacing the small room. "I've read of fevers that make hair fall out, of sickness that bends bones. But this is time itself moving in the wrong direction. If this continues, He stopped himself, glancing at Ruth. "They what?" Clara demanded. "They will not stop at childhood," Green said finally. "They will return to the very start of life. And then there will be nothing left." The words hung in the air like smoke. Elias ordered him out, furious at his cold certainty. But after Green left, Clara sat in the dark by the fire, holding Ruth in her lap, her mind turning over his warning again and again. By October, the Masons had stopped counting the children's birthdays. There was no point. Margaret was now small enough to wear Ruth's clothes. Samuel had the round cheeks of a 6-year-old, though his eyes, still too old for his face, sometimes looked at Clara with a strange, knowing sadness. Thomas spoke less and less, preferring to hum to himself while stacking bits of wood into shapes on the floor. One morning, Clara found Samuel in the barn, sitting in the hay and staring at the door. "She's closer now," he said when she asked what he was doing. "Who?" Clara asked. "The lady," he whispered. "She says she can make it stop." Clara felt the hair rise on her arms. "What lady?" Samuel smiled faintly. "The one in the field. She says she was here before us. Before everyone." That night, a strange wind moved through the farm, bending the tall grasses of the trees stood still. Somewhere beyond the cornfields, an owl called once and then fell silent. The reversal was speeding up, and whatever had its grip on the Mason children was almost ready to take them. By the time winter's chill began to creep into the Georgia hills in late 1808, the Mason family could no longer pretend that what was happening to their children was something they could hide. In the beginning, the neighbors' whispers had been cautious, uncertain. But by now, the rumors had grown teeth. The strange shrinking of Samuel, Margaret, and Thomas was no longer spoken of as illness. In hushed voices and behind closed doors, people began to call it something else entirely. A curse, a punishment, an omen of darker things. The Mason farm became a place people avoided. Once, children from nearby homesteads had come play in the fields or help gather corn during harvest. Now, the paths leading to the Mason house lay untouched, the grass growing tall and untrodden. When Elias took produce into town, people stepped aside, their eyes darting to the children trailing behind him. Some crossed themselves, others muttered prayers, as though shielding themselves from contagion. The change in the town's attitude came to a head one Sunday morning at church. The Masons had been faithful attendees, but that day, the air felt heavy the moment they entered. The preacher, Reverend Cole, stood tall at the pulpit, his voice carrying more fire than usual as he read from the Book of Job. "There are things in this world," he said, his gaze sweeping across the congregation, "that walk in the guise of man, but are not of God. There are afflictions sent to test the faithful, and there are afflictions sent to tempt them into darkness." No one needed him to name names. The congregation's eyes turned, almost as one, to the Mason pew. Clara felt the weight of their stares burn into her skin. Samuel, sitting beside her, fidgeted and stared at the floor. Margaret pressed against her mother's side. Even little Ruth seemed to understand hostility in the air. After the service, the Masons walked out in silence, but behind them, the murmur of voices followed like a shadow. "Witches mark," someone whispered. "The devil's children ought to be sent away before they bring it on all of us." The next week, Reverend Cole came to Mason Farm, accompanied by two stern-faced deacons. Elias met them at the door, blocking their view inside. "We've come to see the children," Cole said. His tone was not one of kindness or concern. It was a voice of a man accustomed to having his orders followed. "They're resting," Elias replied flatly. "Elias," the Reverend said, lowering his voice, "what's happening in your home is not natural. The good people of this town are afraid. I am afraid. We must ensure this is not the work of darker forces." Clara, listening from inside, could feel her heart pounding. She knew that testing the children meant forcing them into rituals and prayers until they either broke or proved themselves to the church's satisfaction. But there was no proof they could give, nothing they could do to stop what was happening. "They're not demons," Elias said, his voice rising. "They're my children." "Then you'll allow us to help," Cole insisted. Elias shook his head. "If you come near them, I'll see you off my land myself." The deacons shifted uneasily, but the Reverend's eyes narrowed. "The Lord's work will be done, Elias Mason, with or without your blessing." That night, the Masons heard something outside. Footsteps in the dirt, too many to belong to a single person. Elias took his rifle and stepped onto the porch, but by the time he reached the edge of the yard, the sounds had vanished into the darkness. The next day, Clara found a crude bundle hanging from a fence post, sticks tied together in the shape of a man, with a scrap of cloth bound around its middle. Someone had scrawled words in charcoal across the cloth. "Send them back." Inside the house, the children's reversal was accelerating. Margaret, who had looked about 7 the month before, now seemed barely 5. Her voice was high and soft, her hands tiny in Clara's grasp. Samuel was small enough that his feet no longer reached the floor when he sat in a chair. Thomas's vocabulary had shrunk to a handful of simple words. One cold evening, Margaret wandered into the kitchen while Clara was stirring stew. "Mama," she said in her sing-song voice, "the lady says we'll be warm soon." Clara froze, her spoon dripping broth onto the floor. "What lady?" Margaret tilted her head, smiling as though listening to something only she could hear. "The one at the field's edge. She's waiting for us when the moon's out. She says we're almost ready." Clara grabbed her shoulders, forcing the girl to look at her. "You must never go to her, do you understand? Never." Margaret blinked, confused. "But she's nice. She says we were hers before we were yours." That night, Clara and Elias argued quietly by the fire. Elias thought they should leave Georgia entirely, head north and find a place where no one knew them. Clara feared that wherever they went, the lady, or whatever force was behind her, would follow. Their decision was made for them the next week when Thomas vanished. It was just after dawn. Clara had been in the kitchen preparing bread when she noticed the house was unusually quiet. She went to the children's room and found Samuel asleep, Margaret humming to herself in the corner, but Thomas's bed was empty. They searched the house, the barn, the fields. There were no footprints leading away from the house, only the frost-covered grass, unbroken. Then, hours later, Thomas was found in the middle of the cornfield, standing barefoot in the cold, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Where were you?" Elias demanded, wrapping his coat around the boy. With her, Thomas said simply, "She showed me where we'll go. It's nice there. No one's old. No one's sick." When they brought him inside, Clara noticed his hair was darker, his skin smoother, his body smaller than it had been just a day before. Whatever had happened to him in those missing hours had pushed him further back than any of the others. By now, the town's fear had curdled into something dangerous. People spoke openly of dealing with the Mason children. Some wanted to bring them to the church. Others spoke of more final measures. The Masons were trapped, too afraid to stay, too afraid to leave. And always, at the edge of the fields, they felt it. The presence of the lady, watching, waiting, calling them back to a place no one else could see. The Mason family had not seen Dr. Amos Green since that tense day when Elias had thrown him out. But in early January of 1809, as frost lay like glass across the fields, he returned without warning. Clara had just finished mending one of Ruth's dresses when she saw him walking up the path, his black coat dusted with ice, his breath fogging the morning air. He carried a leather satchel and something else, a thin bundle wrapped in cloth that he clutched against his chest. Elias was in no mood to greet him. "We told you not to come back," he said, stepping outside before Green could reach the porch. "I know," the doctor replied, his voice low but urgent, "and I wouldn't have unless I had to. There's something you need to see." He unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small leather-bound book, worn, stained, its corners softened by years of use. "This is my journal," he said. "Everything I've learned about them, about what's happening." Elias glanced back toward the door, where Clara had come to stand. Her eyes, tired and red from too many sleepless nights, locked on the book. "Come inside," she said quietly. Once the door was shut and the fire stoked, Green opened the journal. The pages were filled with dense writing, sketches of bones, organs, faces, and, in the later pages, drawings that made Clara's skin prickle. "These," Green explained, tapping the sketches, "are from my last visit. Measurements of Samuel's bones, Margaret's teeth, Thomas's hands. Their bodies are reverting. The growth plates in their bones are closing in reverse. Teeth they've lost are reforming. Their blood chemistry matches that of a much younger child, even though the records say otherwise." Clara leaned forward. "We know that part, Doctor, but why? What's doing it?" Green hesitated, flipping to a page near the back. "I can't answer that with certainty, but I found something strange. Look here." He showed them a page where a family tree had been drawn. "This isn't the first time. In 1774, not far from here, there was a family, the Weatherspoons. For children, same as yours. They began to grow younger, one by one, until they vanished entirely. The records were destroyed, but I found an old midwife's account. She wrote of a woman, tall, pale, always at the edge of the fields at night. She called herself the caretaker. She told the children she could take them somewhere before." Clara's hand went to her mouth. "The lady," she whispered. Elias frowned. "You're saying this thing, this woman, has been here before?" Green nodded. "Maybe longer than any of us know. And I think she doesn't just take them. She unwinds them, turns them back like the hands of a clock, until they are small enough to carry away." The room seemed to grow colder. Outside, the wind scraped against the walls like fingernails. Green continued, his voice shaking now. "I've tracked similar cases. Virginia, South Carolina, even one in England years before the colonies. Always 4 children, always the youngest, always in the same way. They disappear, and no graves are ever found." Clara thought of Thomas's vacant stare after his night in the field. of Margaret humming to someone unseen, of Samuel's strange conversations with the darkness. "We can stop it," she said, as if saying it aloud would make it true. Green closed the journal. "I don't think we can stop it, but maybe we can slow it. Keep them inside. Never let them go to her willingly. Once they choose to follow, it's over." That night, Green stayed at the Mason home, sleeping in a chair by the fire with his journal clutched to his chest. But sometime before dawn, Clara awoke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. She rushed to the window and froze. There, at the edge of the yard, the lady stood. The moonlight fell over her like water, showing a face both young and old at once. Smooth skin stretched over delicate bones, eyes dark and shining. Her dress rippled though there was no wind. She did not move toward the house. She only stood, head tilted slightly, as if listening to a far-off sound. And then Clara heard it, soft, high-pitched laughter, coming from the children's room. She ran inside to find Margaret standing at the window, her small hand pressed to the glass. Samuel and Thomas were behind her, their faces calm, almost peaceful. "She's here," Margaret said dreamily. Green appeared in the doorway, his hair disheveled, eyes wide. "Get them away from the window," he barked. Elias pulled Margaret back, but she began to sob, not in fear, but in longing. The lady outside took a single step backward into the shadows and was gone. After that night, Green's journal entries became more frantic. He noted that the reversal was accelerating. Samuel was now the size of a 5-year-old, Margaret 4, Thomas barely 3. Their speech faltered, their memories slipped away like water through fingers. And yet, they spoke of the lady more often, always with affection, as though she were a beloved relative. Green recorded one conversation with Samuel in particular. "Dr. Green, what does she tell you?" "Samuel, that we belong to her." "Dr. Green, why does she want you?" "Samuel, she says she had us before you did. She says we're going back to where it's safe." The last entry before Green left the Mason farm was written in a trembling hand. "If this continues, they will be gone before the next winter. The parents will not survive it. And I feel her watching me too." When he closed the book and prepared to leave, Clara begged him to stay. "You know more than we do. You've seen this before." Green shook his head. "I've seen what happens at the end, and I won't watch it again." He left before sunset, and the Masons never saw him again. But his journal, forgotten on the table in his haste, would remain in the house, waiting for someone to read the last page. By the winter of 1809, the Mason home had changed completely. The laughter that once bounced off its wooden walls was gone, replaced by the steady, low groan of the wind pushing against the shutters. Curtains were drawn at all hours. Windows were nailed shut from inside. The doors were kept barred, even during the day. Elias and Clara rarely left the house together. One of them was always there to watch the children, to make sure they never wandered beyond the threshold. The outside world had turned its back on them entirely. The townsfolk no longer came by with bread or milk, no longer nodded politely when Elias passed. They avoided the Mason farm the way one might avoid a house marked for death. Even the preacher had stopped calling. Rumor had hardened into certainty. The Mason children were cursed. Some said they were changelings, impostors placed in human homes by spirits. Others whispered that they were already dead, and what walked in their bodies were only echoes, shadows that would one day vanish like smoke. Inside the house, the children's condition worsened. Samuel, who by the calendar was nearly 15, now had the size and body of a small child barely out of infancy. His voice was soft and airy, his eyes wide and curious like a boy's seeing the world for the first time, and yet, deep inside them, there was an ancient sadness. Margaret was scarcely bigger than Ruth now, and Thomas had become so small he could fit in Ruth's old crib. Their memories were slipping away so quickly that some mornings they did not recognize Elias at all. But one thing never changed. They all still spoke of the lady. She was not just a figure in the field anymore. She had become part of their lives, at least in their minds. Samuel spoke to her in his dreams. Margaret claimed to see her at the foot of her bed, even in daylight. Thomas hummed a song he said she had taught him, a slow, lilting tune that made Clara's skin crawl. And then there was Ruth, the only one untouched by the reversal. It began subtly. She would pause at the window in the afternoons, staring at the tree line. She would hum the same tune Thomas did. And then, one evening, Clara found her whispering to someone while sitting alone in the corner of the kitchen. When asked who she was speaking to, Ruth replied in a matter-of-fact tone, "The lady in the woods. She says she can take care of me, too, when I'm ready." That night, Clara could barely sleep. It had been months since Dr. Green left, and she had started reading through his abandoned journal. His last written words echoed in her head. Once they choose to follow, it's over. She realized with a sick weight in her stomach that the lady wasn't just waiting for the 3 afflicted children to finish their reversal. She was beginning to court Ruth as well. The days grew shorter, the nights longer and heavier. Snow came in soft, relentless sheets, muffling the world outside until it felt like the Mason house existed in a pocket of silence separate from the rest of the earth. Elias worked by candlelight, carving wooden toys for children, trying to keep them occupied. Clara sang to them softly, old lullabies from her own childhood. But nothing could cover the sound that sometimes came from outside after nightfall, a faint tapping, like fingertips against a glass, followed by a slow, deliberate knock at the door. They never answered. Then came the day that shattered what little safety they thought they had left. It was mid-January, the fire low, the light outside a pale gray. Clara was feeding Thomas in the kitchen when she heard Samuel's voice calling from the front room. "Mama," he said calmly, "the lady's here now." Clara froze, the spoon still in her hand. Elias, who had been chopping wood in the shed, came in at the sound of her scream. They ran into the front room together and found Samuel standing in the middle of the floor, his eyes glassy, his face lit with a strange joy. The front door, which they had kept barred every night, was wide open. Snowflakes blew in, melting on the floorboards. "Where is she?" Elias demanded, grabbing Samuel by the shoulders. "She's right there," Samuel said, pointing beyond the open doorway. "She says it's time." Clara ran to the door, but all she saw was the endless white of the field and the dark edge of the woods beyond. No figure, no movement, nothing. When she turned back, Samuel was gone. It had happened in the seconds she'd looked away. He had been standing between them, and then he wasn't. The air where he had stood felt colder, heavier, as if something had been pulled through it. Elias tore through the house, shouting Samuel's name. Clara ran into the snow without a coat, scanning the field, her eyes darting to the woods. But there were no footprints. The snow was untouched, smooth as a sheet of glass. Hours passed before they stopped searching. There was no sign of him, no sound, no trail, no scent for the hounds. It was as if Samuel had been erased from the world entirely. That night, Margaret and Thomas did not cry. Instead, they sat quietly, smiling faintly, their small hands clasped together. "She took him home," Margaret said. "He's safe now." Elias sat at the table until dawn, his hands gripping Dr. Green's journal so tightly the leather creaked. Clara sat in the children's room, holding Ruth while she slept, her mind running in terrified circles. She knew now that Samuel's disappearance was only the beginning. The lady had taken the first of them, and she was not finished. After Samuel vanished in the snow, time inside the Mason house stopped meaning the same thing it once had. The day still came and went. The sun still rose and fell. But inside the walls of that small wooden home, every hour was stretched thin with dread. There was no more pretending the children were simply sick. No more hope that things might reverse themselves. The lady in the woods had taken one of them, and now she was waiting for the others. Margaret, Thomas, and Ruth became shadows of themselves, though not in the way illness strips a body. They were physically smaller than ever, their limbs delicate, their voices soft, their faces cherubic. Margaret looked no older than 3 now, Thomas barely 2. Ruth remained her actual age, but Clara noticed changes in her too, a dreamy quality in her gaze, a faraway look as though she were listening to someone speak just beyond the range of anyone else's hearing. The house became a prison. Elias reinforced the doors with heavy beams and nailed every window shut. He kept an axe by the front door, a rifle by the back. Clara rarely let the children out of her sight, and when she did, they were locked inside their bedroom, the key kept on a string around her neck. Yet no matter how tightly they tried to hold the children, the lady's presence seeped in like smoke through cracks in the floor. They began to dream more often, dreams they described in eerie, identical detail. "It's warm there," Margaret would say, her voice distant. "She waits by the river," Thomas would add. "She says it's before," Ruth whispered one night. "Before we were here." When Clara pressed for more, they simply smiled, the innocent, unshakable smile of children who believed they were loved and safe. That was what chilled her most. The lady had won their trust completely. By spring of 1810, Margaret's reversal was almost complete. She had the body of a toddler who had only just learned to walk, but she could still speak in full sentences. A strange, unnatural pairing that made her seem neither fully child nor something else entirely. Thomas had lost nearly all his speech, babbling in half-formed words, his tiny hands always reaching toward the window as though sensing someone outside. It was in May that the second disappearance happened. The day had been warm, the kind that carries the heavy scent of pine and damp earth. Clara had put the children down for a nap in their room, locking the doors always. She and Elias sat in the kitchen, speaking in low voices about leaving Georgia entirely, when they heard it, a faint knocking. Not at the door this time, but at the wall. The sound was soft, almost polite, like fingertips brushing the wood. It came again, this time from the direction of the children's room. Elias ran down the hall, Clara on his heels. He unlocked the door and pushed it open, and there was Margaret, standing barefoot by the window. The nails of Elias had driven into the frame weeks before were gone. Not pulled out, gone, as though they had never been there. "She's here," Margaret said with a happy sigh. And then, in the space between two heartbeats, she was gone. There was no flash, no sound, no movement. One moment she was there, the next there was only empty space where she had been. Clara collapsed to the floor, screaming her name. Elias tore the bed apart, ripped open the wardrobe, even clawed at the floorboards, searching for any impossible hiding place. But deep down, they both knew there would be no sign of her. After that, Thomas began to fade faster. Within a month, he could no longer walk, his tiny body unable to support itself. Clara carried him everywhere, clutching him as if the strength of her grip could anchor him to the world. But he seemed less and less aware of where he was, his gaze always fixed on something invisible. In August, during one of the hottest nights of the year, Clara woke to find the bedroom door ajar. She ran inside and found the crib empty. The air in the room was unnaturally cold, and the faint scent of river water lingered in the stillness. Thomas was gone. Only Ruth remained. For a time, they convinced themselves she was safe. She had shown no signs of reversal. She ate well. She grew taller. Her speech remained sharp. But she had inherited something else from her siblings. The dreams. She began to speak of the place before with the same certainty they had. In the autumn of 1810, Ruth's behavior changed suddenly. She no longer played with her toys or sat by the fire. She would stand for hours by the window, watching the tree line. Sometimes she would wave at nothing. The final night came in November. The air was crisp, the moon bright and full. Clara woke to the sound of soft laughter coming from the front room. She rose quietly, thinking Ruth had gotten up early. But when she stepped into the room, she froze. The front door stood open, and Ruth was standing just outside in the moonlight. Beyond her, at the edge of the field, the lady waited. Her dress shimmered like mist, her long hair lifting slightly in a breeze Clara could not feel. "Come back inside," Clara cried, her voice cracking. Ruth turned and smiled. "It's okay, Mama. I'm going home." Before Clara could reach her, Ruth walked forward, and the moment she crossed into the shadow of the trees, both she and the lady vanished. Elias searched the woods for days, though he knew it was useless. There were no tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had ever passed that way. When he returned to the house, it felt emptier than ever. By the time winter settled in, the Masons were alone. No children's voices, no small footsteps, no laughter. The room seemed bigger somehow, their silence oppressive. Clara stopped speaking almost entirely. Elias kept the journal locked in a chest, though he could not bring himself to destroy it. The town eventually forgot the details, though the whispers never fully faded. The Mason farm fell into disrepair, the land overgrown. By the 1820s, the house stood abandoned. People claimed they saw figures in the windows at night, small figures, moving from room to room. The truth might have been lost entirely, if not for what happened in modern times. In 1974, during a restoration project on the old property, workers dug near the backfield and uncovered a strange burial site. It was not a grave in the usual sense, for small cribs made of weathered wood had been buried side by side. Each was empty. Each had a name carved into the headboard: Samuel, Margaret, Thomas, Ruth. There were no remains, no explanation. The cribs were reburied quietly, the discovery never making the newspapers. But the foreman on the project told a friend, who told another, until the story reached a historian who recognized the names from an old doctor's journal. The last page of that journal, written in a hand weaker than the rest, read only, "She comes in every lifetime. She will come again. And when she does, no lock, no prayer, no force of man will keep her from what is hers." And so, the mystery of the four Mason children remains one of the darkest, most unsettling stories to ever slip through the cracks of history, a tale whispered only in the quiet spaces where truth and legend blur. Were they victims of a rare, unexplained illness, or was something far older and more patient at work, waiting at the edge of the fields for its turn to claim what it believed was its own? We may never know, but perhaps that is the most haunting part, that she could come again anywhere at any time. If this story sent a chill down your spine, imagine what other hidden histories and forgotten enigmas still wait to be uncovered. Subscribe to Behind the Genius. Turn on notifications, and join me as we unravel more mysteries that the world tried to bury. Until then, keep your doors locked, your eyes open, and never ignore the figure watching from the tree line.